Cool.fm is the perfect station for music lovers who enjoy a mix of adult pop, modern country, and classic hits. Our unique blend of different genres creates an awesome listening experience that you won't find anywhere else. With Cool.fm, you don't have to constantly change stations to hear the music you love. Just download the Live 365 app and start listening to our curated selection of modern adult and country hits, as well as the classics you know and love. So tune in to Cool.fm and start enjoying the best of all your favorite music in one place.
Hi, I'm Paul Kupperberg, comic book writer for DC and Archie Comics. You can find me on Facebook or Twitter, and my website is paulkupperberg.net. And you're watching and listening to Two Geeks Talking, and I'm one of them.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comic, film, TV, movie, and video game industries. And of course, I'm your host, Kurt Sasso. We are joined today by a true legend in the comic industry, as well as an amazing author at that. You know his work from, of course, Direct Conversations, as well as others that I'm sure that he'll touch upon when we talk about it. Joined by the ever-talented Paul Kupperberg. How are you doing today?
Hi, good. How are you doing?
Doing good, doing good. For those that don't know anything about yourself as a creative person, tell us who you are and what you're bringing to Two Geeks Talking.
I'm Paul Kupperberg. I've been writing comic books for a variety of publishers since 1975. I started at the defunct Charlton Comics and then went on to a pretty long career at DC Comics, writing and on staff as an editor for about 16 years. Since leaving that, I've been freelance. I spent a stint as the executive editor of the Weekly World News, the late lamented most reliable newspaper in the world. But since then, I've been freelancing and writing books, including, Direct Conversations, which is my latest, which is talks with a bunch of my friends from the 1970s who broke into the business around the same time I did. We chat about the good old days and some not so good old days. So.
Okay, I'm going to ask this question, and this might be controversial. Which one of these friends that you spoke to is your favorite?
There really isn't a favorite. I mean, I was blown away by each and every conversation. I think the one that went in the most unexpected direction was the one with Paul Levitz. Paul is my oldest friend. We met each other in middle school when we were 12 years old and started publishing, crud zines, Xerox crud zines, and until we finally hit on a photo offset crud zine that actually caught on called The Comic Reader. And that led us into the whole business because, it gave us some notoriety and all that. Paul got hired at DC in 1973 to be Joe Orlando's assistant. He was 16 years old at the time. Paul started talking about the business side of things. As you may or may not know, Paul started as an assistant editor and a writer, but he went on to become the vice president of the company, then publisher, then president and publisher of the company. He went into the business side of things fairly early on. He started learning that part of the operation. And he started talking about the transition in the early and mid 70s when the corporate interest changed and Carmine Infantino was released and Jeanette Kahn came in, and just kind of the situation between Jeanette, who was a newbie, and Sal Harrison, who had been there literally forever. Sal worked on color separations on Action Comics #1, as well as on Famous Funnies #1. So he was there literally at the birth of comics and ran DC for years. He was the production manager, but then became president. So anyway, there was some friction there. But anyway, Paul started talking about all these people and all the situation and these guys who were, these businessmen whose names I knew and whose faces I recognized from hanging around. He started talking about the transition and what went on and all those details. And that surprised the hell out of me because, Paul doesn't usually talk about that business stuff. So that was cool.
What sets the creators of the DC Comics Bronze Age apart from other eras?
Well, as several people have pointed out in various ways during the interviews, Steve Mitchell called us the Blue Jean generation. Before that, you'd go up to DC, and I did. I started going up there when I was a kid in the late 60s because, believe it or not, there used to be a weekly tour. You would go up to DC's offices. You'd go to the reception room at whatever date. There have been, I thought it was Wednesdays. Other people think it was Tuesdays. Other people remember it as Thursdays. But whatever day it was, you'd go up there. Somebody from the production department usually would show you around, and they'd give you a tour of the place. So you'd walk through, And there would be, in those days, late 60s, early 70s, before Continuity Associates, Neil used to come into DC every day to work because he liked to be able to leave the house and go to work and didn't have a studio. So he used a drawing board in DC, as did Murphy Anderson. So you'd be walking by there and there'd be Murphy and Neil, doing this brilliant work that, from the late 60s. And then they'd walk you through the offices and there's Julie Schwartz and Murray Boltinoff and this guy and then Bob Kanigher. And so, and as you were walking out the door, they handed you a piece of original art. It's like, here's a memento. The first one I got, an Al Plastino Batman newspaper strip. That was the first piece of art I ever received. We were the first generation to come into comics wanting to be in comics. Before that, it was these older guys. This was a job. Stan Lee famously created the name Stan Lee so he could name for his Great American Novel. People were embarrassed by the fact that they were working in comic books. We weren't. We wanted to be there. We were fans, and we were, we worked. We had our eye on that prize. These guys came from all over the country. Well, Jack Harris was from Jersey, but nobody's perfect. Tony Isabella is from Ohio. Joe Staten was from, I think, Tennessee originally. Anthony Tollin from Minnesota. Michael Uslan was from Michigan. So, no, I'm sorry. Michael went to the University of Michigan. He's from Jersey. But anyway, we were coming in from all over the country, just specifically to break into comic books. That hadn't been the case before. There were guys. Like Gil Kane was a fan when he was a kid in the 30s and 40s, and that's why he became a comic book artist. But we were the fan generation, and so when we came in, we brought a whole different perspective. We were the ones who grew up demanding all this stuff that these guys made up on the fly, get tied together and turned into some kind of unified, universe.
What was the most significant contribution then that each of these creators gave to the Bronze Age of comics?
We all had something to give. It was, again, it was a different perspective. For instance, I love the writing of Bob Haney, who did, The Brave and the Bold. His and Jim Apato's Batman is my favorite rendition of Batman ever. Throughout all of comics history. Bob didn't care about continuity. It was like all of a sudden, Batman's in World War II fighting with, alongside Sergeant Rock. Well, how does that work, Bob? I don't care. It's a good story. So we were the ones, who came in and go, well, we're going to figure this out. We're going to put all this together and make it unified so it all works. And, big mistake. That's how you get Crisis on Infinite Earths. Don't think too much. It's comic books, The whole Flash of Two Worlds, which is, the kind of the birth of the, not kind of the birth of the multiverse. It is the birth of the multiverse. In Flash 123 in 1961, when Flash crosses over into Earth 2, from Earth 1 to Earth 2 to Keystone City and meets the Golden Age Flash. That was set up in Showcase number 4 years earlier, but, suddenly Julie Schwartz, who was the editor, he recalled that bit and said, let's revisit it. And that's what created the Flash of Two Worlds, which led to everything. As far as I'm concerned, Julie Schwartz is the most important editor of the era. Even more so than Stan, because even Stan says, I wasn't an editor, I was a writer. Stan was kind of he wrote herd on these guys, but he wasn't a down in the dirt, pencil in hand editor. He was more of a cheerleader. And again, Stan said this, so Julie kind of created this alternate world and then more alternate worlds. And it took off from them, and we grew up reading that. And again, we're all kids sitting there putting together the pieces of the puzzle because we think it's serious. And, that was what led to that. That we all decided this had to make sense. This had to be a thing that we could put in order.
It's amazing the history of comics and the fact that we all grew up with them in some way, shape, or form, like you've just described here. Has your joy of comics waned in these later years, or do you still appreciate it for the amazing medium that it is?
Oh, I definitely appreciate it. It's still. I think it is an amazing medium. I think it is the only medium where you can do literally anything. Even movies, as much as the special effects and all have gotten, grown, there's more of an intimacy, I think, with the printed page. And you can do things with comic books that you can't do anywhere else. My own personal, I don't really read them much anymore, except going back and reading the old stuff, because, I'm no longer the audience. I'm a retiree on Social Security. I don't think, although, half the writers are Anyway, I don't think they're writing comics for me. I am not the target audience. So, but that's cool. It's evolving. It's changing. It's becoming whatever it's going to become.
So then what lessons can, contemporary creators learn from the works of the Bronze Age creators and legends that you spoke with?
They can learn some storytelling. They can learn to be more concise. There was back in the 70s, Paul Levitz and Joe Staten and I did Showcase number 100. Showcase was a preview book that DC had that ran for years. It gave birth to the Flash and Green Lantern and the Atom and all kinds, the Adam Strange, Lois Lane got a tryout for her own comic book in Showcase. It was just, a catch-all title. If something sold well, challenges the unknown. If it sold well in Showcase, then it would get its own book. I was a big fan of Showcase. I just loved the title. I collected it. When it came back, it was canceled in the late 60s, or around 1970, I guess, with number 93. And when it came back a few years later, with number 94, Paul Levitz was the editor. He assigned me to write it because it was the return of the Doom Patrol, which was another fan favorite of mine from not that long before. It was just, again, this is 78, and Doom Patrol was canceled, I think, in 69. So, I didn't even discover the Doom Patrol until it had been canceled. I found it in reprints, in back issues. But anyway, for 100, we decided we would do this gala issue where everybody whoever got their own feature or title after appearing in Showcase would appear. So we just kind of do this wide-ranging time and space altering storyline. We brought Joe Staten was brought in to draw it, and Joe decided to add all the characters we had left out. So everybody's in there, and it's even Sugar and Spike, who were never in Showcase. But we did that in 38 issues, 38 pages. I mean, nowadays it would be 38 issues. You'd have the whole lead up, you'd have the whole, the prequel, the sequel, but we did it in 38 pages. I've since come to describe it as Crisis on Infinite Earths done in one, but nobody dies. So there's something to be said for that. This whole deconstructed storytelling, which has its place, and there's been brilliant stuff done with it, but not every story needs to be deconstructed. So I think that's the main reason, the main lesson. Like when I started in the mid 70s, new writers and artists, there were literally dozens of titles anthology titles out there. So, there was opportunity to write 5 and 6 and 8 and 10 page stories and kind of learn your craft. And there's no better way to learn how to write a story than to write a short story, especially an anthology story, which has no, it's not like it's a short, I wrote a lot of backups with Robin or Green Lantern or whatever. That you don't have to explain anything. Everybody knows who Robin is. Everybody knows who Green Lantern is. But with a House of Mystery short or Scary Tales, you're creating the whole world, introducing the characters, introducing the situation, setting it up, knocking it down, and you're doing that all in 6 pages. So it's a really great learning experience. And I don't think there's that opportunity out there as much anymore for people to get their practice in. One of the people I talk to for direct conversations is somebody whose name probably is not well known to most people, Bob Toomey. And Bob came in around the same time I did in the mid 70s on He was writing the Crypto feature in Superman Family when I was writing Nightwing and Flamebird. And we became buddies. He lived in Massachusetts and would come in frequently. He only lasted a few years in comics and then went on to other things. But, he said the same thing. It was like this, it was invaluable, to be able to sit down and write these short stories and learn from that. Plus, he had the experience of the legendary Joe Orlando reading one of his romance scripts and saying, this is the worst script I've ever read. And then spending the next several hours ripping the script apart for Bob and telling him what he did wrong and how to do it right. And Bob rightfully says, it's a masterclass. It was the greatest learning experience I've ever had, to have this master's, because Joe wasn't only an artist, Joe was a writer as well. Joe was half of the early Creepy and Aries and stuff. He was the idea man. Joe was not only doing the art directing and drawing, and I worked with him too, as well as an editor and brilliant editor. So, and I don't think there are brilliant editors anymore. I don't know, but I don't hear names jumping out at me like I did back then when I would hear about guys like like Schwartz or Orlando or Dick Giordano. I don't know that these guys are in the business anymore. The best editor I can tell you in comics is Charlie Kotzman, who is the editor-in-chief at Abrams Comics Art, but he's not doing monthly comics. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned.
Experience is always a wonderful teacher to have, but if you can get a mentor on top of experience, it's amazing
Sure.
what you can accomplish. And I find, especially with a lot of independent comics these days, it's if you have a great community or a great following, you can get some feedback in that regard, but you need a professional in the industry to really kind of set you on a correct path.
Well, there's something when you're a newbie writer and you get a script back from your editor and there's more pencil lead on it than typewriter ribbon, because back then we actually used typewriters because computers didn't exist. But Julie Schwartz was a merciless editor. And, on dialogue, not always the best one, but he knew what he wanted and it was always consistent. It is a learning experience. It does make you stop and go, all right, I don't totally agree with what he's done, but I see his point. And more importantly, certainly back then, more so than now, he was my audience. The reader wasn't my audience. Julie Schwartz or Dick Giordano or whoever I was working for, that was my audience. Julie, had been in the business since 1944. And I started working with him in 1980, one or two. So, I think he'd learned a few things along the way. And he was certainly worth listening to.
Everyone usually asks, what's the wisest piece of advice or what's the most BS piece of advice that you've ever received? But what is the second wisest piece of advice that you've received that has stuck with you in your creative journey?
It's a silly little technical bit, but it is always name your characters. I read, when I do read modern comics, I'll frequently pick up something and start reading and nobody's referring to the character by name. Nobody, so I don't know. And since half the artists all draw everybody looking alike anyway, I don't know who's who. If they're not in a costume, I don't know who's who. And I think that's a big problem. I've seen it a lot. Going back to Julie, on my first Superman script for him, he gave it back to me with all the edits and stuff. But he said, you didn't tell the reader that Clark Kent is Superman. And I said, everybody knows Clark Kent is Superman. He goes, there might be one new reader who's never read a Superman comic before who doesn't know it. That's who you need to tell. Clark Kent is Superman. So it really is important. You don't think about it. You assume the whole world knows, but it's got to be somebody's first comic book.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's something I learned in film school, actually. Like, always name your characters, even if it's man one, woman one, whatever. Get a name down and you can change it later.
Yeah. And always know where they are in physical space.
Yes. That's kind of important. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the first experience where you learned that language had power?
I grew up knowing that. I didn't have the happiest childhood, and there was a very negative person who I lived with who made it very clear that language had power and used it to beat me with. So I've always known language has power, and I've always kind of tried to be a little careful because of that.
Were there any creators you wanted to include in this book that you didn't get a chance to for whatever reason?
Well, I did have a few more people on the list, but everybody I called said yes right away. There was one writer who didn't want to do a verbal interview, but would have done it, a written interview. But there's really no way to make this type of conversation work that way. But other than that, everybody said yes immediately. I kind of, tossed the list and went, well, that's good. But yeah, no, it was very gratifying. Everybody was really cooperative. Everybody understood, the reason I wrote the book, I didn't write the book, I transcribed the book. The reason I did the book was because everybo's dying. I'm going to be 68 years old next month. All my friends are in the same age range, those who are still surviving, and the loss of Marty Pasco recently, in the last year or two, that was kind of the final straw. Marty had the best stories. He was a great storyteller and a phenomenal memory. Not to have his stories down on paper was a shame. And I wish I could have talked to him and published that. And I realized, well, you know what? There are people in my life who I still know, who are still with us, who also have stories and experiences, and I should try to get those on paper. One of my influences for direct conversations was Will Eisner's Shop Talk, which was talking with creators from the 40s, or 30s and 40s. Milton Caniff and Joe Kubert and all these guys. And reading it, I've read that book several times since it's been published, and I reread it before I started working on direct conversations. And it's just like, thank goodness Will preserve those stories for us. I hope I've done a little bit of that for my generation of creators. It's a rich history, and there's a lot of stuff like, just a little story. Steve Mitchell told some great stories about just being in the office and dealing with artists, and the interactions with Joe Kubert and Neil Adams and Sal Harrison, who I mentioned before. It's priceless. Those stories, it's not like, these are personal stories. This is where I was sitting and what I overheard and what happened. Steve sitting there in the coffee room when Denny O'Neil comes in and goes, I just lost, Jim Steranko on The Shadow. What am I going to do? Bernie was on it, and then he was off it, and then, Mike Kaluta raising his hand and going, can I draw it? It's like, wow, really? So those stories, they deserve to be saved. I'm happy I had the chance.
History is always important.
Sure.
It's amazing who you get to speak with and what you learn. And this is an amazing book that I can't wait to pick up and read. If we don't learn from our history, if we don't learn from the stories of the past, we're doomed to repeat it as
well. We don't, and so I mean, look around. But still, at least people should try to shout warnings from the from the towers. So.
You've also written many other books as well too, and this is actually the Direct Connect Conversations is a sequel to a previous book. What was that book for those that haven't seen it?
It's called Direct Comments: Comic Book Creators in Their Own Words. These were interviews I conducted about 1990. I used to write DC's comic shop giveaway, Direct Currents. In it, it was kind of what was coming up that month, and there'd be a few feature articles on whatever was the big project that month. And one of the articles would be an interview with one of the creators involved in the thing. So I would get on the phone and record, an interview with them, and then transcribe it and cannibalize that for the written feature article. I did over 90 of those, although I only found the raw transcripts of the interviews for about 22 of them, which is a shame. I wish I could have, had the rest of them. That would have been amazing. So I took those and I edited them and heavily annotated them, lots of footnotes, because I was talking to people 30 years ago about stuff that happened 30 and 40 and 50 years before that. So there's a lot of footnotes in it, but it's just these, nothing revelatory. These guys knew they were talking, for publication, a DC puff piece, but still, so there were, including Murphy Anderson, Jim Aparo, Brian Bolland, John Byrne, Dick Giordano, Michael Grell, Ed Hannigan, Adam Hughes, Carmen Infantino, Lee Mars, Denny O'Neil, Jerry Robinson, Kurt Schaffenberger, Julie Schwartz, Walter Simonson. And I had interviews. One was a fanzine interview that was done with Murphy Anderson that never got any wide distribution, so I included that. This is from 1973-ish, 2 or 3. It was conducted by me and Carl Gafford at Murphy Studio in New Jersey. So I had that, and also there was a fanzine interview that Paul Levitz and I did with Jim Warren for a fanzine in 1971. And it's a very interesting interview, not for anything Jim reveals, but except for what he reveals about himself. It's just a very bizarre little interview. He's like, we're 15, 16 years old trying to sit there, and he's trying to be this big shot intimidating us. I don't know why we were just doing this crappy little fanzine, but Jim just had to show off. So anyway, so that's a book that I'm proud of, and I'm glad I got it out there, because again, it's not as raw as perhaps the Direct Conversations, but it's still interesting for the times.
A lot of people don't understand being on this side of the microphone, or this side of being an interviewer. It's a difficult process sometimes, because there's the research, there's the investigations, there's the conversation as well too. What style of interview you want to do. How did those aspects affect yourself as the interviewer or talking with these amazing people?
Well, certainly back in the direct comments, those interviews, my job was I wasn't part of the story. My job was just to be an impartial, listener, and just to take the relevant and interesting things and turn it into, a story. Direct conversations, I really wanted it to be a shared thing. I mean, I did let them do most of the talking because you spread out over 10 interviews. I can speak less in each one and still have, still say what I need to get out, what I want to say. But that one was more of a give and take. I've done a lot of interviews and been interviewed. Finally, I'm just lazy enough that I just don't even bother a lot and just kind of rely on my innate knowledge of the subject. Actually, with direct conversations, I started the first couple of 3 interviews. I went in there really heavily prepared. I had notes and I had questions, and like any battle plan, it didn't survive the first shot. So I just after that, it's just like, you know what? I'm just gonna do a little reading beforehand, look at their CVs, maybe read their wiki just to get a sense, but other than that, I'm gonna just go in there totally unprepared and let's see what comes out of it. And I think it worked.
Sometimes the most natural conversations are the best, personally. So.
Yeah, well, I had to throw away any agendas I had because it was a conversation. I wasn't leading it; I was part of it. So wherever it went, I was more interested in them going where they wanted to go than where I wanted to lead them. Because again, like with the talk with Paul, I never would have asked him to describe how he took over the business side of things and what happened. Wouldn't have occurred to me. I would have been talking to him about, Tex Blaisdell and Joe Orlando.
Everyone has one person that inspired them on their path to where they are today. Who was that for you?
I think I'm going to have to go back to Julie Schwartz as far as, the whole comic book world. I mean, I didn't know who he was, but his comic books were the ones that drew me in, and that, that gave me that safe haven that I found as a kid. So I think the way, he built his worlds and the things he published, I think that probably influenced me most in life. It's weird to think, I mean, I became friendly with Julie in later years after he retired. Even traveled with him a few times to conventions when his regular traveling friend couldn't make it. Yeah, I would have to go with Julie.
From a professional standpoint, you are a very accomplished writer and author and creator of many amazing works that we've known and loved all throughout the years. And I'm kind of geeking out here, so I apologize. But professionally, you are very successful in that regard. Do you consider yourself personally successful?
I guess. I mean, it's there's always so much more you want to do, but yeah, I mean, I can look around me and see, what I've accomplished. I've done enough stuff that I'm proud of. That yeah, I would say I've been successful. I mean, the fact that you want to listen to me talk, and and you ain't the only one. Means I must have done something, or either that or you guys are just desperate for guests.
No, 15 years and 1,200 plus interviews. I'm just fortunate enough to speak with anyone that comes on the show that is an amazing and talented person. I thank you as being one of those 1,200 plus. So the reverse of success is failure. How do you deal with your failures?
You just kind of got to let them go and move on. I mean, I've had many failures creatively, personally, emotionally. It's like a divorce. Once you're divorced, move, keep going, on to the next thing. And there's usually something better. Did get divorced in 2010. And then in 2017, I met this wonderful person that I've been with ever since. So all the turmoil I went through there had a payoff at the end. Yeah, you just roll with it. You keep going. Otherwise, you sit in a dark room and you watch a lot of Golden Girl reruns.
Okay, who is your favorite Golden Girl?
Oh, Rose. Yeah.
Love it.
We're not going to do Kill F Marry with them, are we?
No, I'll save you the.
Okay.
The younger generation is looking at your work and they're becoming inspired to be creative in their own way, whether it's as an author or writer or maybe something creative that you've inspired them in some way, shape, or form. How can they inspire the generation that follows them?
Just do your best work. I don't think anybody sits there while they're creating and goes, what's going to make the reader or the viewer or the whatever happy. They create what they want to create, what makes them happy, what gives them satisfaction and fulfillment. If you're happy with it, then hopefully a significant number of your audience will be happy with it. And if not, tough. I mean, you've done what you do. You can't do it for anybody else but yourself. I mean, I know I've been most of my life a commercial, writer. I say I'm a retail writer. It's like how many pounds you want, boom, I deliver. But I can't turn in a script until I'm satisfied with it. I did. I have a book out from a couple of years ago that the title was "I Never Write for the Money, but I Always Turn in the Manuscript for a Check." And really, I think that's what you got to do. You have to just turn off everything else except the creative when you're doing it, and you worry about the business before and after.
If your life was a comic book, what would its title be? And what would its soundtrack be?
I'd probably be Herbie the Poor Little Fat Boy. That's my childhood image. I actually have a couple of photographs of me as a kid in the 60s with the bangs, the hair with the bangs. And I was overweight and had glasses. And it's like, God damn it, that's Herbie Popnicker, man. What would the title be? I don't know. The Not So Thrilling Adventures of Nowhere Man. I don't know. And the soundtrack would definitely be jazz. It would have to be, it would have to be some, it would definitely be jazz.
Well, Paul, I do hate to say, but that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun.
Before I let you go, where can we find you? How can we support you? Of course, where is this amazing book and anything else you'd like to promote?
I am on Facebook and Twitter at Paul Kupperberg. My website is paulkupperberg.net. I have a shop on there, so you can get all my books. You can order them directly from me, or you can order them through Amazon. I also, since you asked, I wrote this as well, which is kind of my taking my 40 plus years of experience and condensing it into 118 densely packed pages of useful information about creating comic books. PaulKupperberg.net. Get them directly from me, signed and personalized, or you can order them, any of my books, on Amazon.com.
Well, like I said, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. You can, of course, find this interview and 1,200 plus others on our website, tgtmedia.com or twogeekstalking.com. That's the word two, not the number two. Website's going through a revamp. So go to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/TGTmedia. The podcast is back after 12 or so years, which is twogeekstalking.podbean.com, or just search Two Geeks Talking on your favorite iTunes or Spotify or whatever else you get your podcasts on. And as I say every week, everyone has a story to tell. It's up to me to bring that out. Thanks for listening and watching on Two Geeks Talking.